Hey guys, thanks for joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. If you're a returning listener, it's great to have you back. If you're new to the channel, we're glad you joined us and we hope you like what you hear. So, our podcast is for people that want to learn something new or make themselves a little bit better every day. So, in today's episode, we're going to dive into freedom of speech and why freedom of speech is so critical to our country, to our liberty, to our freedom. And this is spurred largely because there has been a real shift in private companies, most notably X, Facebook recently, Meta, they call themselves now, changing their thoughts and their approach to free speech on their platforms. And in this episode, we're going to talk about that, the difference between the government's responsibilities to provide or not to abridge people's rights to free speech and private organizations like an X or a Meta and what their different responsibilities and rights are as it relates to freedom of speech. So let's just dive into it from there. There's a quote from Benjamin Franklin that we think is very appropriate for the topic. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. So it's not a mistake that freedom of speech is encapsulated in the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's there because it's one of the most important aspects of our country and of our democracy. So in this episode, we're going to dive into 3 reasons why freedom of speech is critical. We're going to talk about what speech is protected, which includes hate speech and lying. And that might not excite people, they might not like it, but it's absolutely the truth. And we've got a couple of Supreme Court decisions that validate this, that protect just reprehensible speech. We don't advocate, we don't agree with it, but we agree with their right to express themselves and say it. We think they're wrong, we think they're despicable, we disagree with it. However, when we start trying to censor people or allowing the government to start censoring people, it's a very slippery slope towards the loss of freedoms. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to give some examples. So that's the episode. Let's dive into it. So, first reason, freedom of speech protects the exchange of ideas. So it allows for open debate and the exchange of ideas. Even those, and I would argue especially those that are controversial or unpopular. So that's the most important aspect to remember about freedom of speech is it is there to protect speech you dislike. It is there to protect speech that offends you. It is there to protect speech that you disagree with. The majority or a group should not be able to silence a person. The government should not be able to silence a person or a minority voice or a dissenting opinion simply because they don't like it or they don't think it's right or they think it's dangerous. And the examples we'll talk about just about that. So I think we've got some good examples to illustrate what we're talking about here. Now, one caveat, you cannot, you cannot, freedom of speech does not protect speech that incites violence, known as fighting words. Now, that is a very specific carve out, and we've looked up some cases. We didn't include them because they're a little bit heavy and they don't illustrate the points we think as well as the couple that we included here. But there have been cases where people have said we advocate for violence, and the court has said that's protected. They're not saying go kill Jim. They're not saying go ransack Betty's house. They're saying if push comes to shove, we're prepared to defend ourselves. And people have the right to say those things and advocate for those things so long as they don't specifically try to incite specific acts of violence. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So, reason number 2, freedom of speech guards against government overreach. And that is by far, from our perspective, that is by far the most important aspect of freedom of speech. If the government can silence dissenting views, they can concentrate power, they can push things through, and they can slowly move us towards fascism. And it's very interesting because in the speech that we are looking at, the things that people have decried about President Trump, soon to be President Trump, are the exact types of speech that are protected. So we find it very interesting that everyone's a Nazi that supports Trump, or he's a fascist, or he wants to be a dictator. They have every right to say those things. Now, he was president for 4 years. He was not a fascist. He was not a Nazi. He was not a dictator for the 4 years he was in. And we've seen no evidence that he's going to take any of those approaches in his second term. However, we defend people's right to make those statements. We find them ridiculous, and we think it's very lowbrow thinking. It's not well thought out argument, in our opinion. But they have the right to say those things, and we defend their right to say those things. Now, the other thing to remember here is what we're talking about applies specifically to the government. That's federal, state, local, to the government. So a company like an X or a Meta or a Blue Sky or insert social media platform here, they have the right to have policies and say, we're not going to allow X, Y, or Z on our platform. But they have to deal with the ramifications of the public blowback if they disagree with those things. And we think, and from our experience, we're very certain we're right, most Americans want a healthy debate about topics. They don't want to have one side silenced simply because they disagree with them. There's a small but very vocal minority of people who say that speech is offensive, that speech is hateful, you should not be allowed to say that. We don't agree with that, and we think most Americans don't agree with that. But remember, we're only talking about the government as it relates to those things. Now, there is probably an argument to be made somewhere, and we're not going to make it in this episode, that because there is such a concentrated use of a platform like a Facebook, like an X, Blue Sky just started, like a Truth Social, there's not as many people on there, Rumble, those platforms, that they may have a responsibility to be more lenient on freedom of speech so that the marketplace can hear all ideas on a topic. But they're not required to. They're privately held companies with owners that get to make decisions about what they do and don't want on their platform. Just like your company can say, hey, we're not going to allow this type of speech or these types of comments to be made when you represent our company. They have the right to do those things. This applies specifically to the government. But just because something's offensive doesn't mean that it's not protected. So there's some examples. Burning the American flag. So in Texas v. Johnson, a protester burned the American flag, and was the government wanted to prosecute them. That case made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, that is a freedom that they have. They are able to express themselves by burning the American flag. Even if it makes your blood boil, even if you really dislike it, they have the right to do that. We think they got that right. We think that's right. We are totally against it. We are not for burning the American flag. We think it's sacrilegious. We think it's wrong. That's just us. But they have the right to do those things. I could never imagine doing it, but they have the right to do it, even though we think it's bullshit, straight up. So we did have a case in here, Brandenburg v. Ohio, that talked about speech that was not protected because it was meant to incite violence. However, we took that example out because the wording of the decision was pretty heavy, kind of hard to get through. And there's literally been, since it was decided in 1969? There's never been an application of it. So we didn't think it was super useful. Now, what we did do was looked at several other examples, and there were two examples of speech that was protected under the First Amendment that are pretty extreme. It's pretty extreme speech, and it was absolutely protected. So a little quote in one of the articles we looked up was from Noam Chomsky, and we're not Noam Chomsky fans at all. However, we think this is a very good thought by him. If we don't believe in the freedom of expression of people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. And I think he's right when he takes that approach and says that. Because even people who express unpopular opinions are protected by the First Amendment. In fact, they're the ones that it's most important to protect. That prevents majorities from silencing the views which they don't agree with, even views the majority of people really, really despise. And those are the two examples that we've got here. So in Brandenburg versus Ohio, he was a Ku Klux Klan member. Clarence Brandenburg was a Ku Klux Klan member. And he delivered a speech in Hamilton County, Ohio, which is down by Cincinnati. And he called for revengeance against Jews and African Americans. Non-specific. He didn't say this person, that person. He called for revengeance against them. He was convicted under 2 Ohio laws, which punished the advocacy of the duty, necessity, or propriety of crime or violence as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform. He was sentenced to prison, fined $1,000, and he appealed it. He took that all the way up to the Supreme Court. Brandenburg argued that the Ohio law violated the First Amendment, which states in part, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So when it got to the Supreme Court unanimously 9-0, agreed with Brandenburg. And it struck down the Ohio law as unconstitutional. When it was interpreting the First Amendment, the court reasoned that government cannot punish speech unless it meets 2 criteria. First, if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action. That is the specific, we should go kill Jim, like we've been talking about. And the second, if it is likely to incite or produce such an action. So a generic statement saying, I love white people, and we should get revengeance on the Jews and the blacks, while reprehensible, while disgusting, while morally unbelievable, is protected. And it's important that it's protected, even though the vast majority of us disagree with it. I would argue they're despicable human beings that think that, but they have the right to think that. They have the right to say that. The next case was 1978. The National Socialist Party, which are Nazis, literal self-proclaimed Nazis, applied for a permit to march in the heavily Jewish community of Skokie, Illinois. 2 weeks later, the Skokie Board of Commissioners passed an ordinance requiring all marchers, to post a $350,000 insurance bond. And then the board later passed an ordinance banning the distribution of printed materials that promote hatred of groups of people or marching in military-style uniforms. So this group also appealed these laws, and those made it to the Supreme Court as well. And the Supreme Court ruled the Nazi Party could not be prohibited from marching peacefully because of the content of their message. So again, reprehensible, disgusting, completely vile opinions and thoughts, but those are protected under the First Amendment. And we think it's very important that they remain protected under the First Amendment. So again, private censorship differs from government action, and private entities are not bound by the Constitution. But the government cannot stop that speech. The government should not stop that speech. So we thought those were 2 very good examples because they're so egregious. Like the vast majority, 99% plus of our country would disagree with those thoughts and concepts. But it's important that we allow them to happen to maintain the freedom of speech that we've enjoyed in our country for 250 years. Okay, so reason number 3. Freedom of speech fosters accountability and social change. So speech enables whistleblowers, activists, and just regular citizens to challenge injustice. So one of the best examples is Martin Luther King and the peaceful protests that he led to push for civil rights for blacks in our country. So technically, slavery ended in 1865. I can't remember when the 13th Amendment passed, but it was right after the Civil War. But we all know that is not when racism and bigotry ended. And in fact, there's still racism and bigotry in our country today, without a doubt. It's lower than it's ever been, in our opinion, and we're in a better spot than we've ever been as a country, but that still exists. But if you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was rough for black folks back in the 50s and 60s. And Martin Luther King used his freedom of speech and others' freedom of speech to advocate for change and demand equality. And he was largely successful in the movement that he ran. There's contemporary examples of online platforms that amplify voices calling out corruption or corporate wrongdoing. Think about all of the things that you hear about, this company does X or that company does Y. That's freedom of speech in action. That's advocacy in action. And the challenge that we have is good intentions, right? We love the movie Hot Fuzz. And the whole concept of the movie Hot Fuzz is there's a group of people in this small village in England that literally are killing people that disagree with them. It's a comedy. And it doesn't sound like it's funny when they're killing people, but it's actually a very funny movie. And this group always cites the greater good, the greater good. That's what good intentions are. It's this mindless greater good mentality that says, we know best. You should make sacrifices because we tell you, because it's for the greater good. Now, are there instances where that probably makes sense? Sure. Is speech one of them? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We fundamentally disagree with that. The problem becomes at some point, you, me, everyone is going to wind up on the short end of the stick. We're going to wind up with a minority opinion on some subject or topic. And if we allow the majority in any instance to silence the minority, it creates a real slippery slope that leads us to a really bad spot really quickly. So those are our thoughts on freedom of speech. We thought it was relevant with kind of this shift, this paradigm shift, this mental shift, where we think people are finally thinking about it correctly again. Freedom of speech ensures the free exchange of ideas. It protects citizens from government overreach, and it fosters accountability and progress in our society. So again, this is directly related to the government. Private entities, private businesses have the right to do what they want to do, but they have to pay the toll of public opinion based on those decisions. And that seems fair. So the whole point here, I think, can be summed up in a quote that we love. I vehemently disagree with what you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it. And that is the mentality we have to have for freedom of speech if we want it to truly be free speech in our country and truly protect our liberty and our democracy. So, love to hear your thoughts on these subject, guys. Leave a comment. Tell us about experiences you have or thoughts that you have related to this topic. And that's the episode for today. So don't forget to go to our website. James puts it up over here every day, saltygingertalk.com. We've got all of our podcast episodes available there. We've got links to all of our social media accounts there. And then we publish a newsletter every weekday. We cover current events in the newsletter. We let loose a little bit and have a little fun. We're sarcastic and snarky, and we have a good time doing it. We think you'll enjoy reading it. It's maybe a 5-minute read. It's a good way to start your morning off with some current events and a little chuckle. And you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website. So don't forget also, like, comment, subscribe on whatever platform you catch our podcast on. It's super helpful for us if you're able to do that. So everybody have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode, guys, and we'll see you at the next one.